Hello, everybody. Today, our share is titled Opposing Jewish Factions Seeking Islamic Fatwas During the Maimonidean Conflicts. So, today we're going to explore how 13th century Jews sought religious edicts from the Muslims, known as fatwas, from Islamic courts to intervene on behalf of both sides of the Maimonidean conflicts. This was a period of intense religious polemics between the Jewish followers of Maimonides, who were rationalists, and the Jewish followers of the Rambam's son, Avram ben Rambam, who were mystics. And after the Rambam's or Maimonides passing in 1204, what can only be described, I know it's called the Maimonidean conflicts or the Maimonidean controversies, but a better word would be the Maimonidean civil wars, because there really were civil wars, sometimes quite violent, that had broken out amongst these two groups of Jews. And these conflicts determined the future of Judaism. They were arguing about which direction future Judaism would go. Would it go in a direction of rationalism, or would it go in a direction of mysticism? We know that the mystics won. And this was the time that the Zohar was beginning to emerge. It came out in 1290. So this was at that moment of tremendous theological turmoil. And the interesting thing is that the mystical opponents of Maimonides were often backed by the Christians. The Zohar emerges, as you know, in northern Spain, in Christian Spain, and the Christian groups like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and even King James I of Aragon supported the mystics. So they brought in the big guns, as it were. The mystics brought the big guns in from the Christian environment. But what is less known, and this is what we're going to deal with today, is that Jews in Islamic lands, both mystics and rationalists, in other words, both factions of this conflict or the civil war, appealed to Islamic authorities for fatwas in support of and against, either in support of or against Maimonides and Maimonides' rationalism. So this means that all three Abrahamic faiths are getting involved now in what was really an eternal Jewish split. And it also seems that something about this conflict between the rationalists and the mystics must have resonated, never mind just within Judaism, but within Christianity and in Islam as well. It seems to have touched a nerve in all those faiths, because there was something so fundamental going on during this time, and it had to do with our understanding and our definition of religion and where religion should go. Does it take a rational turn, or does it take a mystical turn? Now, based on documents that have been discovered in the Cairo Geniza, which is what we're going to do now, or in a moment, we're going to look at two documents, actually a couple, but specifically two documents, Arabic documents that are found in the Cairo Geniza, and I'm very grateful to some Islamic scholars who pointed this out to me, because I cannot read Arabic. But we're going to look at Jewish efforts from both the Maimonidean side and the anti-Maimonidean side to solicit intervention from Islamic authorities. And they wrote documents, both sides wrote documents to the Islamic authorities, obviously in Arabic, but we now have them translated. And it's amazing how both sides were looking to get fatwas to put this whole matter to bed, in order to come out like almost like a psak of the Beit Din to end this very fundamental conflict. But first, we have to look at a background because we need to have a context. So, Judaism and Islam shared some very important and very similar developmental parallels. Judaism, we know, had an oral tradition passed down from father to son, from generations. It fermented into a written tradition later on when we have the Mishnah and then the Gemara, which together forms the Talmud, which developed between, shall we say, the 3rd and 7th century, more or less. According to some, as we know, we've learned before, the oral tradition may have continued right up until the 10th century. But Islam also had an oral tradition. Now, Islam only emerged after the official end of the Talmudic period from about the 7th century, but they also had an oral tradition. And they began with what they call the Sunnah, which is the tradition, was transmitted orally from teacher to student by reciting the Hadith, which are recollections of what happened to their prophet, Muhammad, but they were transmitted orally. And this oral transmission in Islam continued till the 10th century. And it was only then in the 10th century that the Islamic authorities got together and they decided, well, we've had these hadiths from the Sunnah, these oral traditions. Some of them conflict with each other, they contradict each other. Some of them may not be authoritative. So they sat down and they essentially determined which of the teachings are authoritative and which are deemed not authoritative. Now, we often hear people talk about a shared Judeo-Christian tradition and between Jews and Christians. It's very popular today. It's been probably exploited politically. But the truth is that the term Judeo-Christian tradition only emerged in the 19th century. It's a relatively new term. But historically, it is, whether we like it or not, more accurate to refer to a Judeo-Islamic tradition. But unfortunately, our long, long tradition has not yielded much traction in today's world. But we're not having a political discussion here. We're simply looking at the history. Now, the mystical Jewish opponents of rationalism often found inspiration in Islamic mysticism. That's from a historical point of view, and this is very, very well documented. May not be well known, but it's very well documented. Let's look at a couple examples. Take Bachya ibn Pakuda. So he dies in 1120, and he is the author of the famous book Chovot HaLevavot, which everyone has today on their bookshelves, and they study this and they share him, and people talk about this a lot. People often don't understand the provenance of this particular sefer. But this Chovot HaLevavot, or Duties of the Heart, as it's called in English, quotes Sufi texts verbatim, literally word for word, lifts texts out of out of Sufi literature and simply repeats them in Chovot Halevavot. And we've had a share on this, and it's on the blog, and we've written about this at great length. And Bachya ibn Pakuda, the author of the book, he wrote his book in Judeo-Arabic, which means he wrote it in Arabic, in the Arabic language, but in Hebrew characters. So he doesn't write in Arabic letters, he writes in Hebrew letters, but phonetically it's Arabic. And he starts his book with the Islamic greeting, Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim, which is the traditional Islamic greeting, and it's taken from the opening of the Quran, which is very interesting to see that the author of the Chovot Halevavot, in his original writing, not the translation, his original writing in Judeo-Arabic, begins with that greeting. Now, later on, in the 12th century, when Yehuda ibn Tibbun translated from the Arabic to the Hebrew, which is Chovot Halevavot, because it was given an Arabic title when Bachya ibn Pakuda wrote it, but when it became Chovot Halevavot later, 200 odd years later, he changed the opening because he knew that the opening wouldn't sit well with the Jewish community, and he wrote, instead of Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim, he writes, Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael. So he takes an Islamic greeting and he Judaizes the original greeting. Now, in the introduction to Chovot Halevavot, you can see an acknowledgement by Bachya ibn Pakuda to the notion that he has taken teachings from other traditions. So let me read you what he says. This is from the Hebrew translation. Let me read you what he says. He says that he has drawn min ha-Chasidim. He has drawn from the Hasidim. Now, the Hasidim aren't Jewish Hasidim here. These are mystics. Hasidim are mystics. He's obviously referring to the Sufi mystics, which were popular at the time and which we know he drew from. But he drew from them. He didn't only draw from Islamic mystics, he drew also from Christian mystics. So he drew min ha-Chasidim v'ha-Chachamim, from the sages and the pious people. Pious people is a synonym for Hasidim. So he drew from these mystical teachings, Shebachol Ummah, from all the nations. And all the nations obviously would have been Christianity, Islam, probably a little bit of Hinduism. But he openly acknowledges that he's drawing from the Hasidim, from these Hasidim, non-Jewish Hasidim. Shehigiu Divreim Eleinu, whose words have reached us over time. And we know that he made references and quoted often from the Islamic teacher Al-Ghazali, who brought Sufism officially into Islam. So that just in one particular work, the work that's regarded as a great foundational work on Jewish mysticism, is rooted by its own admission and by a study of the history of its provenance, is rooted clearly in mystical traditions from elsewhere, particularly from Islamic Sufism. Another example, and this is a great irony in Jewish history, is Maimonides, the great rationalist, has an only son, Avram ben Arambam, or Avram ibn Maimon, as he was officially known as. And Avram ben Arambam openly embraced a form of Jewish Sufism. In fact, it was practiced in Egypt for a couple hundred years, a couple of centuries, by the Rambam's grandchildren until we get to David, who went to Aleppo with the Aleppo Codex that the Rambam had ordained as the most authoritative Jewish Torah scroll. And from there, the greatest library, or one of the greatest libraries in the Jewish world, was established in Aleppo. And the Kabbalists from Tzfat, centuries later, in the 16th century, journeyed down to Aleppo, it wasn't terribly far, and they took these teachings, these Sufi teachings, and introduced them into Tzfat. And we know there were Jewish Sufis living in Tzfat. So you can make a very strong argument that a lot of what we today call Luriani Kabbalah was also based on a form of Sufism as practiced by Jews for centuries, the Egyptian Jews particularly, descendants of the Rambam, the Rationalists, but this descendant through Avram ben Rambam, going on eventually to David, I think about 5 generations, is Rambam's great grandson. So there was an open embracement of Sufism. Now, on the rational side as well, just to show that we didn't only draw from Islamic mysticism, we also drew from Islamic rationalism. And the greatest example of this, of course, and it's well attested to and well documented, is the Rambam himself. And we know from previous studies, when we looked at Avram ibn Daud, who was the Rambam's unspoken mentor, both of them were severely influenced by Greek philosophy, particularly by Aristotle. But we never got sources directly from the Greek philosophers because they were not translated into Hebrew yet. We took them secondhand through Arabic writers who had translated the Greek into Arabic. So Rambam clearly, and this we know, looked at these Arabic texts. And from these Arabic texts, he managed to gain access to Greek philosophy, rationalist Aristotelian Greek philosophy. And he clearly drew from Arabic sources like Al-Farabi, who died in 950, Avicenna, who died in 1037, and also, and most particularly from Averroes, who was the most rationalist of them all. He's kind of known almost as a second Aristotle, but he was an Arabic writer, and Rambam drew particularly from him. So Rambam took his Aristotelian philosophy particularly from the Arabic writer Averroes, who died in 1198. Rambam was born in 1135. Okay. Let's have a little closer look at the parallels in the history of Judaism and Islam. An intriguing dynamic known as nomocentrism emerged in both Judaism and in Islam. Obviously, Islam came later, only from the 7th century, so we had already completed the Talmud by the time they were beginning. But the parallels are still there. That we've already discussed the parallels with the oral tradition. But Judaism and Islam, as opposed to Christianity, developed a very interesting system of religion. Nomocentrism. What does it mean? It means that besides faith, because Christianity is very big on faith, what you believe in, Judaism and Islam, in the beginning, in the early stages, were not all that concerned with dogmas of faith. Not at all. Faith didn't matter. It was practice. So nomocentrism is a focus on practice as opposed to belief. So Christianity is not a nomocentric religion, but Judaism and Islam are. In other words, Judaism and Islam are structured around their respective religious laws. So we have halacha, and they have what they call the fiqh for the Muslims. And only Jews are allowed to keep the halacha, and only Muslims are allowed to keep their fiqh, or their practice of law. But the interplay between these two now becomes quite complicated because they're all living in each other's societies. Jews were living predominantly in Arabic societies. In fact, from the 7th century, 90% of the Jews until recent times have always lived in Islamic lands. 90% of the Jews were living under Islam for most of our history. 90%. 10% were living in Christian lands. That's a huge number. So this is something that we cannot remove from the equation. So when 90% of the Jewish people are living in Islamic lands and they're interacting, and often there was turmoil, but often there was not turmoil. But the question arose, what do we do? Because only Jews keep halacha and only Muslims keep the fiqh. So how do we interact in the public arena? And then there's questions of who is a Jew, and then there's questions of who is a Muslim. And of course, it was quite easy to define in the early days, because a Jew was someone who practiced, remember, nomocentric. Someone who kept halacha was a Jew, and someone who kept the fiqh would have been a Muslim. It was very easy. But from around the 10th century, in both religions, there was a development and a move away from the practice of religion, in other words, the practice just of pure law, just pure halacha or pure fiqh, and introducing the notion of dogma and faith and what we would call today a systemized theology. Now, the Talmud has very little theology. The Talmud redacted in the year 500, maybe a little bit later, as we said, but still, that you don't find much theology in the Talmud. It is a book on Jewish law, the derivation of Jewish law. But the question now started from about the 10th century to emerge. How do we define a Jew and a Muslim now? Before it was easy. Someone who practiced, they were Jewish. They practiced Judaism, they were Jewish. Who practiced Islam, they were a Muslim. But now, when we start introducing the notion of a theology, it becomes very difficult because you can't see a person's theology. You've got to take them by their word. So you can't just look at them and say what they're doing in the street. Oh, that's a Jew, that's a Muslim. You had to go inside their minds, and that wasn't easy. Because what is the determinator now? So the determinator of who is a Jew and who is a Muslim shifted at the same time from a nomocentric model to a dogmatic, philosophical, not in the rationalist sense, but in the mystical sense, in the theological sense, to articles of faith sense, in an article of faith sense. Is the determinator still practice, or do we now have to change the determinator of our identity and move it into the area of faith? And then how do you determine a person's faith? So these were very interesting developments taking place round about just before the time that the Rambam is born. Now Rav Sadia Gaon, and he dies in 942. So that's exactly where we're talking now, in the 10th century. Now, Sadia Gaon, he's known kind of as the first rationalist, the person who got the ball rolling, moving away from a nomocentric religion. And he starts becoming very interested in theology. And he writes a book, obviously in Arabic again, and the book is called Kitab al-Amanat al Taqidat, the book of articles of faith and the doctrines of dogma. This is the book that Sadia Gaon, Rav Sadia Gaon writes. He's the Gaon of Surah, so he's a well-known, he's a respected Gaon. He's one of the last of the Gaonim, or the later Gaonim. And he writes this book about Jewish dogma. Later, it was translated in it was translated by Yehuda ibn Tibun, who also translated the other works that we mentioned before, Chovot al-Vavot. But he changes the title now from the Arabic title to Sefer Emunot V'Dayot. Now, if you look at that word, the book of Emunot, what is that? The book of beliefs. And the book of knowledge probably better would be translated the book of theology. Because now we have a book, probably the first Jewish book that's been produced. This is 200 odd years before Rambam. We now have a book where the very title is the book of beliefs and theology. So we're now introducing theology into what was previously a nomocentric religion, focusing mainly on Talmud and on Jewish law. It doesn't mean there was never theology before. There was, but the way one scholar described it, it was always belief in, not belief that. In other words, in the Talmud, of course, the Talmud tells you you've got to believe in God, and the Torah tells you have to believe in God. Of course, there's a notion of faith, etc. But it's belief in. We don't really know what it is. Now we're defining belief that God does this, and we're defining God. It's becoming a theology, a religious philosophy. It's a theology. If you believe in God, God can remain very vague. I believe in God, yeah. But if I believe that God is this, that, or the other, then my theology, then I've developed a theology. And that's what Kotzk Blog did. He introduced the notion of theology into the Jewish religion. And the title of his work, emphasizing faith, dogma, and belief, captures this shift towards a more theological approach to Judaism, which we never had before to this extent. And of course, what happened after Rav Kotzk Blog, a short while later, or 2 centuries later, Rambam comes on the scene, and Maimonides. He's a great rationalist, but again, Rambam was a complicated person because besides being this great rationalist and introducing Jewish rationalism, he also builds on the notion of theology. It's very difficult, as we've said so many times, to define Rambam. He wasn't just a rationalist. He certainly had a mystical component. And he certainly had a component somewhere between mysticism and rationalism. But he introduces the notion of the 13 principles of faith, Ani Mamin. He never wrote the Ani Mamin, and the Ani Mamin changed some of the words in the 13 principles, but it doesn't matter. The Rambam still came out with the notion of 13 principles of faith. So now to be a Jew, you're no longer nomocentric, just keeping the halacha, you now have to keep 13 principles of faith. And you can be defined. Your Judaism now is no longer defined by what you do. It's not enough. It's by what you believe. And there's 13 things you need to believe to be a Jew. So the way we identified a Jew was no longer, oh, he puts on tefillin, he's a Jew. It's what you believe. And around the same time, Islam is doing exactly the same thing. Very interesting to go into it and find out, what came first, the chicken or the egg. But Islam is also developing a systematic theology under people like Imam al-Shafi and Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who was an influence we mentioned before on Chovot HaLevavot. Now, why did Islam turn to theology? We've mentioned why Judaism did. Why did Islam turn to theology? And the explanation is very interesting and slightly different from why Judaism turned to theology. There was an early Islamic sect. Some describe it as the first Islamic sect, a product of the first Islamic civil war. So this is right in the 600s, in the 7th century. And there was a sect known as the Khawarij. This was a violent group. And they emphasized exactly what we were talking about. Radical nomocentrism. In other words, practice, practice, practice. It's what you do. You've got to do. You've got to keep the Islamic laws. You've got to abide fundamentally by whatever is written in the Quran. And if you don't, you'll be killed. This was an extremely violent Islamic sect. Practice of the law was dominant. There was no notion of theology. There was no refinement. It was very simple. You looked at a person, you could tell them, you're a good Muslim, you're a bad Muslim. The problem was, if you're a bad Muslim, if your only means of defining who's a Muslim is by your action, then you're an apostate. Because you can't say, well, I just did an Aveira, as it were. I just did a sin, but I still believe in Islam. That's no good, because there's nothing really to believe. It's about action. So you can become an apostate. You can convert out of Islam, but simply by means, not of what you believe, by how you practice. So if you don't practice, you're an apostate. What happens if you're apostate? You can be killed. And there was the notion that a sinning Muslim, in other words, someone, nothing to do with belief, but someone who disobeys the Islamic law is an apostate from Islam, and he can be killed and must be killed by a good Muslim. In other words, a Muslim who practices. So this was part of the philosophy of this Khawarij Islamic sect, and they controlled Islam for centuries, from the 6th century until we start getting to the 8th century. From the 8th century, the Islamic world got a little bit tired of its own original fundamentalism, and a scholarly elite began to emerge, a more philosophical and, for our purposes, a more theological scholarly elite emerged, and they also decided to develop a more ethereal approach to Islam. In other words, it's not just Islamic fundamentalism. It's not just that you do what it says in the Quran with no human interpretation. And they started developing theoretical, theological, and doctrinal frameworks to move away from this reductionist view of the early sects of Islam. And it's interesting that they're doing this the same time as Bakr ibn Fakuda is developing his ideas. Sufism is beginning, the mysticism is beginning to become integrated into Islam as well. It's so interesting to see how these things are happening in a kind of parallel. And basically, by the time we get to the 13th century, this is the time of the Rambam already. In both religions, practice is no longer good enough. In both religions, you're no longer a good Jew or a Muslim if you just practice. You have to have a little bit of a theological component, or quite a strong theological component. And you are now evaluated not just by your deeds, but you're evaluated by your creed. What do you believe in? So this was a shift. This is a tremendous shift, a fundamental shift, pardon the word, because it was a move away from fundamentalism, but it was a tremendous shift in both religions, from what we would call orthopraxy to orthodoxy. Orthopraxy is where you practice, where your orthodoxness is only in practice. Now orthodoxy is an orthodoxness in thought, in theology. And this is how we start developing an orthodox Judaism, not the way we use it today with Orthodox and Reform. Rambam introduced orthodoxy. Rambam turned Judaism into an orthodoxy, introduced an orthodox component into Judaism, as were some of the scholarly elite within the Islamic world at the same time. Now, the scholars within Islam, and the reason why I'm mentioning this is because the Jewish writers mention these all the time. If you read through the writings of the Rambam, particularly his Moreh Nevuchim, he uses words frequently, and it's important that we know what these words mean. So the Rambam references frequently the notion of the mutakalimun, and the mutakalimun are simply the scholars of the kalam. You can see the word kalam in mutakalimun. So these are the scholars of the kalam. It's the same thing. The mutakalimun are the scholars who study this body of literature now called the kalam. What's the kalam? So this is exactly what we were referring to, this introduction into Islam of a more rationalist, a more philosophical, a more theological approach to religion. It's a dialectical theology, which drew on Greek philosophy. So we have a rationalist bent, as it were, within Islam, and the rabbis are becoming very interested in the kalam. Rambam references it a lot. He's not always happy with the kalam because he believes it's not rationalist enough in his Moreh Nevuchim. And he refers to the mutakalimun, in other words, the scholars, the Islamic scholars who study the kalam. And these are the words that Maimonides himself uses. We know that even before Maimonides, Rav Saadia Gaon, who we mentioned earlier, drew on the Kalam as well, and also referenced the Mutakalim, these Islamic scholars of theology within this branch of a theological rationalist component to Islam. And Sajjagon was particularly interested in one of the most extremely rationalist forms of the Kalam, which are the Mutazila or the Mutalazites, the Mutazila, a particular branch of the Kalam. That's the most rationalist branch of this body of literature, and that was of great interest to Rav Sadia Gaon. And it seems that by the rabbis mentioning this, Rambam and earlier Rav Sadia Gaon and others, that this notion of the Mutazila, this rationalist branch of the Kalam, had particularly appeal to the Jewish public, which is a very interesting development. Now, just to show how strong this new movement, this new rationalist, this new theological movement was within Judaism, rabbis now began to emerge criticizing Rambam and even Rav Sadia Gaon and even Bachi ibn Pakuda for flirting too closely with Islamic theology. So by the time we get to the 15th century, you've got people like Don Yitzchak Abravanel, who criticizes Maimonides. And look what he says. He says that Maimonides and Maimonides and his ilk and his following and his predecessors, this whole school that's come to be known as the Maimonidean theological philosophical school, he says, brought in, they postulated, I'm quoting to you from Abravanel in his Rosh Amanah, which is called Principles of Faith, interestingly enough, on page 194. So he says that Rambam postulated, you can already see it's already like a negative term, theological principles. He introduced theology and dogma into Judaism because, and look what he says now, the Jews were drawn after the custom of Gentile scholars. In other words, he's giving this criticism. Often people criticize Maimonides for taking too much from the Greeks. But over here, Abravanel is saying that Maimonides took too much from the Muslims. Because this is a reference, the Gentile scholars over here would be the Muslims, particularly. In other words, he's engaging too much in systematic Islamic theology as described in their books. In other words, he's reading books like the Kalam, the Mutazila. He's reading this kind of literature, and Don Yitzchak Abravanel criticizes Maimonides basically for changing Judaism, but not from the inside, from the outside. So this is a fascinating criticism that we see in Abravanel, who acknowledges the process that we have just described now. But the fact remains that the shift that was brought about by Maimonides, it's cast in stone. It's now part of Judaism. We can stand on our heads as much as we want and say he should have, he could have, would have, whatever. The fact of the matter now remains that this is the Judaism that we have today. These 13 principles of faith form very much part of how we define Judaism today. It forms our Judaism today. It doesn't matter where you trace the origins to. It has de facto become the Judaism of today. To the extent that Rambam writes in his Mishnah Torah, and he writes the following, and here you can see it very clearly. He says, if you have a Jew who commits every possible transgression, every possible aveira, he'll be punished according to his rebelliousness, but he kind of says, so what? I mean, I'm saying, so what? He doesn't say that. He He'll be punished, but he still has a portion in the world to come. In other words, he's still a Jew. He does every Avera, says the Rambam, but he's still a Jew. But if a man doubts, continues the Rambam, any of these theological dogmas and foundation, in other words, these 13 principles of faith, if a Jew doubts the dogma that has now become Judaism, regardless of how it came into Judaism, he leaves the community. Look at this fundamental shift. It wasn't just a shift, it was an absolutely fundamental change in defining the identity of a Jew. So if you do an Avera, okay, it's bad, you shouldn't do Averas, but you've still got a place in the world to come. You can still do Chuvas. But if you don't have correct dogma, correct theology, you're out of the community. And you can be called a min. You can be called an apokorot. You're basically an apostate. You're out of the Jewish camp. You're no longer a Jew. You belong in some other religion because of the dogma. So you can still be keeping the law, but your faith is wrong. You're out of the camp. And that's what you find in the Rambam. Sorry, this is the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah, not the Mishnah Torah. This is in his Pirush Mishnah. So what Maimonides was saying is that denial of the principles of faith excluded one literally from the Jewish community, even if you practice the law. And the classic Talmudic separation between law and belief, because the Talmud wasn't that interested in belief as a dogmatic paradigm. Now belief and law through Sadra Gaon, through Rambam, belief and law became merged in this new formulation of Judaism, which we never had before, where belief became as important as practice. It wasn't like this in the Talmud. And in fact, you could even argue that belief became more important than practice. And apostasy now was not rejecting the law or simply converting to another faith, but apostasy now was someone who neglected the theological formulations and paradigms of the faith, of the dogma, of the systematic theology. And even conversion to Judaism in earlier times. And we see this in the Talmud. If you wanted to convert, they didn't sit you down and say, learn the 13 principles of faith. They didn't have them yet. So in the Gemara, there's stories about, like, in the Gemara Shabbos, Lamed Aleph, I think it's Amud Aleph, this guy comes to Hillel and he wants to convert, and he says, just don't do what's hateful to you, don't do to others, which is an emphasis. I know people spin it differently, but it's an emphasis on doing. Don't do. It's not so much what you believe. Belief doesn't come into it, and there are many other examples as well. So within the Talmud, if you wanted to convert, you just had to do. You didn't have to believe. It was deed, not creed. After Rambam, it very much became creed above deed. Deed was important, but creed was primary. So, for example, here we have another interesting thing. Now, that was a Talmud, deed, not creed. Now look what the Rambam says. Now that in the Talmud, the Rambam, when we have creed, now look what he writes. And this he writes in his Mishnah Torah, in Isure Bia. He writes, a guy wants to come in, a person wants to come into Judaism, he wants to convert. So Rambam writes, Modin oto ikarei hadat. So you've got to teach him ikarei hadat, principles of faith. See that? You didn't find that in the Gemara. No principles of faith. Now the guy wants to convert. It's not enough. He can keep Shabbos till he's blue in the face. He can put on tefillin the whole day. Not enough. You have to teach him ikarei hadat. You've got to get into his mind. You've got to get into the theological part of his brain. Umarichin badavar zeh. And you need to elaborate on this. Spend a lot of time working on the theology. Umarichin. Study this at length. Teach this to him at length. Because he has to change his belief. He can't believe in his old systems. You have to change his belief. Umodin oto miktzat mitzvot kalot. And when it comes to practice, you can inform him a little bit of some of the light mitzvahs. Don't overburden him burden him with deed and with all the things he has to do and feeding his potatoes and all sorts of things like that. Don't overburden him. Just give him a few light things. He can buy a packet of machine matzah. It doesn't matter. Ve'ein ma'arishin b'davar hazeh. And once again, don't elaborate too much on the deeds because you'll just chase that person away. So it's a very, very interesting shift that took place, which we can see how the different ways of converting changed. In the earlier times when we had a nomocentric religion to the time after Sadhya and after Rambam, when we now had a philosophy based on emunot v'dayot, on principles of faith and on theology. Now let's start moving on to the Cairo Geniza, and this is where things become rather interesting. So documents were found in the Cairo Geniza. Now, people have always studied the Cairo Geniza for a long time, since I think, 1896, when Schechter made his breakthroughs. But what's not really studied all that often, or Jews don't get to study very often, are the Arabic writings in the Cairo Geniza. Obviously, we're living, as we mentioned, we're living in the pockets of the and side by sides with Muslims in Islamic cultures for so long. It's not surprising that we're going to find a lot of Arabic writings in the Cairo Geniza. There's a lot of Hebrew writings. People have studied that a lot, but the Arabic writings have been studied by Islamic scholars, perhaps more than by Jewish scholars. And we're going to look at one or two examples of this now, which brings, which shines some fascinating light, particularly on the Maimonidean controversies, which I'm going to come to soon. So the documents in the Cairo Geniza express and are proof of the intense interaction and interplay between Jews and Muslims. They had court cases. They were trading with each other. They were living next. They were neighbors. They spoke the same language. There was very much. They actually referred to as Arabized Jews. And it's not surprising, therefore, that a large component of the writings that we find that have survived from that time in an attic in the Ben Ezra Shul, where they threw for hundreds of years all their old papers, only discovered in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century. Not surprisingly, they're going to find Arabic writing. Now, when we look at this, we get fantastic insight, a really deep insight, and I think quite a novel insight into that period of time. So, what the Muslims did is they appointed, like today, it used to be, today we appointed chief rabbi, Jews appointed, but in times earlier, the Christian authorities would appoint a chief rabbi. So some people are not happy with the office, with the notion of the office of the chief rabbi, because the origins came not from within, but it came from without. But the same thing happened in the Islamic world, where they would appoint, not the Jews, but they would appoint a leader of the Jewish people. And the leader of the Jewish people here was called a Nagid. And what was the job of the Nagid? So if you remember, in the days of Cyrus was good to all the vassal states. This is between the first and the second temple. Cyrus wanted to keep all the people in his realm happy. He wanted the Jews to be happy. The Babylonians also, by the way, wanted to keep the Jews happy. They said, come, you can live here for 1,000 years, and they let us produce a Babylonian Talmud. So it's not surprising that under Islam, they said, right, you come, you live under us. We want you to be happy and to keep your religion. That doesn't mean that there weren't periods of conflict. Of course there were, and violent conflict. Of course there were. But there were also periods when what I've just said played out in a very successful manner. So the job of the Nagid was officially to administer justice. In other words, the Jews look after their own justice. So we'll let them have their own court they can have a based in. We'll let them live. We're not going to make them live under our law, but we will, we might impose a tax upon them, but we'll give them a sense of autonomy. They were responsible for marriages, So if you wanted to get married, you'd have to go to the rabbi. The rabbi would have to marry you, and the rabbis would all fall under the nugget. So this is a very good system because they allowed the Jews to live according to their law, and their marriages would be respected according to Jewish law. Circumcision as well, bris. They didn't say you must go to the state clinic. You go to the mohel. So now you go to a mohel. And these were all things that the Muslims put in place to allow the Jews to be autonomous. They could collect their own tzedakah and distribute their own tzedakah, etc., etc. Now, one document that we find in the Cairo Geniza, it was issued by al-Malik al-Afdal Ali, and he was the eldest son of Saladin. And it shows there, this document, that al-Malik went out of his way to keep the Jews happy, but to the extent that he wanted to keep all of the Jews happy, living all in their own bubbles. So he says, we must have rabbinites. Rabbinites are basically Jews who follow rabbinic law, what we today would call Orthodox rabbinic law. They're called rabbinites because they go by the rabbis. So there was a sect of rabbinites. There was a sect of Karaites, the Jews who kept not the oral law, but they kept only the written law. Malik also wanted the Karaites to be happy. They were also Jews. They were Karaite Jews. They said, okay, so we'll appoint someone in charge of the Karaite. And then there was the Samaritans, who were also kind of Jewishish, and they would have their law, but they would all be kept happy. And he wanted to keep all these people happy. Didn't try to convert them, didn't try to make them like himself. These were very interesting developments that took place within the community. Now we're in the year 1040. Now we're going into the Cairo Geniza a little bit more now. A case comes up. A matter arises. There's a conflict in a shul. Right. Okay. Now, this is interesting. So when there's a conflict in a shul today, what do? You go to the Jewish press. I don't know. You go to the Gaboim. You tell your people your friends at a Malava Malka what's going on. But what they did in Cairo in 1040, in the 11th century, they went to the Islamic leadership to sort out the problem of the shul. And what was the shul? It was a famous shul. It was the shul of Palestinian Jews. So the Jews had come from Palestine, as it was called, was known as the Palestinian Jews in Fostat. Fostat was Old Cairo. So these were Jews that come from Eretz Israel. They didn't mix with the Egyptian Jews, so they were Palestinian Jews, but they had their own shul in Fostat. Fostat is Old Cairo. That's where the Cairo Geniza was, from the old shul in Fostat. And there was a dispute now in that shul. Who's the Rov of the shul? Who's the leader of the shul? So the contestants were Rabbi Shlomo ben Yehuda. He was the local rabbi, had been there for ages. And then there was another rabbi, Natan ben Avraham, who arrived from North Africa. So now we have a wonderful argument taking place. Who's the Rov of this old shul in Cairo? Later became known as the Ben Ezra shul. But who's the Rov of the shul? Now, it wasn't just some machloket. People were somewhat dissatisfied. It broke out into violent clashes. So once again, we have a civil war among the Jews. And this was violent clashes between the followers of these two rabbis. And the majority favored Shlomo, the rabbi who had been there all along. They didn't like the impostor who had come from North Africa. I suppose they wanted to keep it a Palestinian rabbi of the Palestinian community. But the problem was that Natan ben Avram from North Africa had contacts in the government. So now he's pulling contacts and trying to influence the powers that be. And he managed to get the Fatimid Caliph Mustansir to close the shul down. And he closed the shul down because he didn't want the Palestinian rabbi to be the rabbi of the shul. So he said, well, then no one's going to daven there. If they want Shlomo to be the rabbi, then we're going to shut them down. They were able to daven there. And the shul closed between 10:39 to 10:41. Now, it's interesting that I've read some accounts where they show they don't like to highlight this history. They change the history a little bit and they say the shul was closed for renovation. You know, they were painting the shul. But from the Cairo Geniza, we can actually see what really happened. Now, let's move on to our documents. In the period that we're looking at now, the Nagid, the leader of Egyptian Jewry, is Avram ben Arambam. So Maimonides has died, so we're after 1204. The Nagid now is Avraham ben Arambam, and as we mentioned earlier on, Avraham ben Arambam, the only son of the Rambam, breaks away from his father's rationalism and establishes a form of Jewish Sufism. In other words, changes the face of Sufism. Zohar comes out 86 years later, and Lurianic Kabbalah develops through this as well. So it was a very significant individual, Avraham ben Arambam, introducing a sense of mysticism, in his case, Jewish Sufism, into Judaism. But he's the Nagid now. He's the leader. And that's why, as I said, for generations, there were Jewish Sufis. Egyptian Jewry was defined by their adoption of a form of Jewish Sufism. Remember, Sufism was kind of neutral. They had to fight to get it into Islam as well. So it shouldn't be surprising that it could have been molded into Judaism also. It wasn't necessarily an Islamic belief system. It may be known by that today, but it may have been more neutral at the time. But now the Sufis took over the shul. Now the Jewish Sufis. Avraham ben Arambam was now in this old shul. And the problem was, it was an old shul that had old traditions. Now, you know what it's like going into an old shul and changing the practices of a shul that's been doing it for years and years and years. Just as an aside, forgive me, I once had to do a funeral somewhere in a country community, and shame that they had their gaboim and they had their chibukadisha, and I should have just kept quiet. They did a couple of things that I thought were wrong, and I told them, no, you can't do that. So this one old guy comes up to me and says, we've been doing this for 56 years. So I said, well, you've been doing it wrong for 56 years. And afterwards, I felt terrible because, you don't mess with customs. Anyway, this kind of thing is what happened now. Avraham ben Arambam is now the Nagid, and he's now the Rov of the shul. But he's introducing changes, but they're not just changes. They're mystical changes to a shul that was fundamentally rationalist for a long time and had a tradition of being the Rambam center of Jewish rationalism. And now they're introducing, now that Rambam died in 1204, Avraham ben Arambam dies in 1237. So for 30-odd something years, they were introducing new mystical customs into Avraham ben Arambam's father's rationalist shul. So the old guard who was still in the shul, who still remember Rambam, were not happy. So what did they introduce to the shul? They introduced what's called prostration and genuflection. Yes, I had to look up the second word. Okay, so prostration, we know, means to bow down. So in the temple, when we prayed, we used to bow down. The practice was then abolished, and it was kept as a practice that when the third temple comes, we'll go back and we'll do the old temples and we'll bow down. But now we have a different form of prayer, and what's it called? The Amidah. Now we always hear the Amidah, everything. Okay, it was called the Amidah. But it was called the Amidah in stark and sharp contradistinction to the form of prostration where you would bow down. It was called the standing prayer. So you dafka didn't bow, you stood. That's what it's called. You stood, but you stood. It was a protest against people wanting to perpetuate temple practices after temple times, because certain things were only kept for the precinct of the temple. So it was called Amidah, not just because of that's the standing prayer. We all know we stand, but we sometimes forget why we stand. We stand dafka because we didn't stand in the temple, because we bowed or we lay flat down. But now Rambam wants to introduce bowing down. And as Adam says, they took a stand. Exactly. They took a stand, a mystical stand, by bowing down. Correct, Adam. Very good. But of course, now the old God wasn't happy with it. First of all, they were changing, the Rambam had codified the law and specifically told us that we no longer bow like that. We only did it in the temple. And now his son's bowing, and now everyone in the shul's bowing. Now you come to shul for davening, and everybody's bowing, and they're doing these mystical practices. But they do another practice as well, genuflection. So what is that? It's a kind of a courtesy. Now, there was something going on with this courtesy, and the way I understand it, I may be wrong, but the way I understand it, based on what I've read, is that it was a courtesy. It was a kind of a semi bow, but not in prayer. It was a bow to leaders. So when you came in front of a leader who you regarded as the authentic leader, you do like a kind of a courtesy, like before the queen or the king or whatever. But it seems that the Rambam was opposed to that kind of bowing, and that you could only do that genuflection to a person who was like a genuine tzaddik. The point I'm trying to make is there were issues with doing this courtesy to people who weren't really befitting of being courtesied to. But they were now courtesying to their leader. I would imagine it has to do with the conflict between the mystics and the rationalists. So if you courtesy to the mystics, it means that the rationalists have lost, because now the leader is the mystic, is no longer the rationalist. But whatever the effects were, they were certainly bowing, and they were certainly introducing a kind of a courtesy to leadership in some form for whatever reason. And the old God, the followers of the Rambam, were not happy with either of these practices. That's the bottom line. So in the one document, and it's a document in Arabic over here, in the Cairo Geniza. So I don't read Arabic, so I'm not going to read it. I have difficulty pronouncing Arabic, even written in English characters, but be that as it may. In the document, I looked at a translation. In the document, it alludes to the synagogue's age. I'll read you a translation in a moment. Why does it do that? As I said earlier, showing that these new mystics, these rebel mystics, are introducing something into a shul that's this old shul of Palestinian Jews that's been standing for ages. And they're introducing mystical practices into a shul that was a Rambam shul that had a history. And now they're changing that history. They knew that the relatively conservative Islamic authorities would respect. They respected old texts. They believed it must be accurate according to text. The Islamic scholars are very pedantic about being accurate and quoting texts accurately in their tradition. So they believe that by going to the Muslim authorities and saying, well, these people are introducing some kind of a reform, a mystical reform into the Rambam's great shul, and you respect the Rambam. The Rambam was the physician to one of your earlier leaders. They thought that by saying, emphasizing it was an old shul, by showing that there's a line of tradition and authority, that they would get support. But what did they want to do? They wanted the authorities not just to come in guns blazing, but actually to issue a fatwa. Well, we understand a fatwa is a religious edict. It's quite usually the way we understand it now is it's a radical Islamic decree, usually something that Jews aren't happy with. But in those days, Jews were looking to get a fatwa issued by Islamic authorities on other Jews to stop them making innovations. In other words, in this particular case, the Maimonidean Jews, the Jews from the old God, in this letter, in the next letter, we're going to go reverse. Once the Jews had been there for a while, and now the mystics have been there for 20 years, and now they want to get rid of the rationalists. They also wanted a fatwa. I'll come to that very briefly in a month. But right now, we're looking at the rationalists trying to get rid of the mystics by getting a fatwa, issued. So they allude to the synagogue's age, they allude to the established status of the shul of the synagogue, and they appeal for a return to their tradition, to the ways of the Rambam, the rationalist practice, which would be appropriate in such a venerable institution. This was a choshev synagogue. It was an important shul. It was like a great synagogue. So they wanted a fatwa to be issued that the Jews would not be allowed to bow or to curtsy to their leaders in the shul. Imagine that. Imagine that. They don't go to Beis Din, they don't write to the Jewish press, they go to the Islamic courts, the religious courts, to get a religious edict issued, a fatwa, to stop the minhag of the mystics, the new Hasidim, in the shul. The group of new people who took over, the followers of Avram ben Rambam now, the new mystics, are called pious, which is like we mentioned before, the Hasidim that Bacha ibn Pakuda mentioned, the Hasidim of the non-Jews in that case, the Sufis. Here we're talking about the Jewish Sufis. They're also called pious, which is fascinating because the term pious, which is what Hasidim means, is used to refer to the mystics. So they refer to the pious people who have moved into the shul. Now, what I'm saying to you now is my own original thought on how one interprets the letters. I've heard different interpretations of these letters, but they haven't come from Jewish sources. So I believe that we can look at these letters, put them in their Jewish historical conflict, and I place them slap bang in the center of the Maimonidean conflict. And I believe that is the only way that one can read these letters and understand these letters, knowing what was going on within that period. These Maimonidean conflicts continued for about 300 years, and some would argue continues to this very day. But this was right at the beginning. In the first 20 years after Rambam had died, this was in the same geography as where the Rambam was living, in the same Dalit Amos, the same synagogue where the Rambam had preached his rationalist doctrine. His son is now preaching the mystical doctrine, and this document is produced in that 20-odd years period, and therefore one needs to look at it within that context. That's why what I'm suggesting is that you need to read these letters within the context of the Maimonidean controversies. I believe that this is a new form of research understanding in understanding these letters that are already not known because they're written in Arabic. Now, another allusion that one finds, and what makes me think that the reference to these pious people who've moved in, calling them pious, besides the fact that that the Sufis were called Hasidim by the rabbis earlier, but the Hasidah Ashkenaz. Now, this was a parallel development within Judaism taking place, this time in Germany, but Hasidah Ashkenaz emerged between the 12th and the 13th centuries. What centuries are we talking about here? Exactly that. 1240. This is around about the date of this letter. This letter would have been written a little bit earlier while Rambam was still alive, so it would have been between 1237, before 1237, but still around about that time. It's the same time as Hasidah Ashkenaz is developing very differently based on German and perhaps Christian folklore in Germany, but they're called Hasidah Ashkenaz, the pious people of Germany, but they're called Hasidim. So, and that's language from that very period. Different geography, but the same period. That's again supporting this notion that the people, the mystics, are the followers of Avram ben Rambam, the Jewish Sufis, and they're referred to as such, as the pious people. All right. Now the letter, which I'm going to read you a translation of, also begins Believe it or not, with the same way that Ibn Pakuda started his Chovot HaLevavot before it got censored. So the letter starts with Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim. There we go, with the first opening lines of the Quran. So the Jews are writing to the Islamic leaders, quoting the first line of the Quran, the traditional Arabic greeting. That's how the letter written by these Jews. But remember, this is now written by the Maimonidean Rationalists. That's our first letter, the Maimonidean Rationalists. So it says, in the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate. That's what the greeting means. And it goes on saying, you imams of religion and guides of the Muslim and guides of the Muslims. So clearly they're writing to the imams, right? They're not writing to the civil courts, they're writing to the religious court. They want an edict, they want a fatwa. They're cutting to the chase. May God grant you the success of wise men. What do you say about the following? In other words, he's asking for your legal opinion. We're asking for your fatwa. A community of Rabbinite Jews. Now look at this. Look at this letter and you'll see how this fits in structurally to everything that I've tried to explain earlier on. A group of Rabbinite Jews. So this ties in, but you've got the Rabbinites, the Karaites, and the Samaritans. So they're identifying what Jews they are, because by the Muslims, there were three different kinds of Jews. They wanted to keep them all happy. So now this is that pocket of Rabbinite Jews. Okay, so it says, a community of Rabbinite Jews have a synagogue of great age. Here we have that reference. This is the way I read this, especially looking at the dates of the letter. It's just years after Rambam passed away. It's obviously referring to the Rambam, in my opinion. But a group of Rabbinite Jews have a synagogue of great age that still stands after many years, standing with the structure and form with which its builders built it. It's impressing upon them the notion is here we have a great synagogue. It's part of our culture. It's been here forever. All right, so we've established a bona fide historical connection to the synagogue. It still continues the customs, rites, and traditional proceedings regarding the readings and prayers throughout the year on weekdays, Sabbaths, and festivals. Look at this astonishing piece of writing. It continues the ways of the Rambam. Shabbos, the Vochadika prayers, the weekday prayers, continue the same practices that it's been practicing as long as it's been standing. It's an allusion to a well-established minhag of the rationalist Maimonides in his very synagogue. It has a prayer leader administering its affairs. That's got a gabba, a prayer leader, a chazan, who has followed the customs of his predecessors. Sorry, I just got a phone call or something. I assume you can still see me. My apologies for that. I just tried to switch off. I hope I didn't switch off the wrong button. But be that as may, I'm just going to continue. I hope that you're still there. It has a prayer leader administering its affairs who has followed the Maimonidean customs. I add in the Maimonidean customs because I believe it's obviously can only be referring to the Maimonidean practices. So the prayer leader is continuing with the old God, and the community is content with this. So the Kehillah is happy to be still the Rambam's dead, but they continue with the legacy of the Rambam. What a fascinating letter. We've been taken now, I believe, into the heart of the Maimonidean concept. We're not just reading history, we're actually looking at it playing out in real time by looking at this letter. So this is an appeal from people wanting to hold on to the last vestiges of the Rambam. Now, all of a sudden new people, okay? Suddenly now new people, not the same old people, new people, which is obviously the followers of Aram ben Arambam, the mystics, the Hasidim, have worked in concert, they're ganging together. There's a lot of them, to change its customs. See that? They're changing the customs. Avraham ben Aram is changing the customs of his father. They're now introducing mystical customs into the shul. Stop its traditions, its rationalist traditions that it's had for years. Alter its prayers. They're changing the nusach, introducing a Hasidic nusach into the shul. and coerce the prayer leader so that an unprecedented innovation be made. Unprecedented innovation. Do you see what's going on? They're doing a radical change that Rambam would have rolled in his grave if he knew what was going on in his shul. While the community and the prayer leader wish to continue with the status quo. They want to continue the old ways, but now you've got so many people. As I mentioned, the Jewish Sufis were becoming the norm in Egyptian Jewry. So they've ganged together, but there's a few old people who want to continue the ways of the Rambam. And this again shows you how already just years after Rambam passes away, his rationalism was already being pushed out of Judaism, literally just years later. The community and the prayer leader wish to continue the status quo. And now they say, and they ask two questions. Now, these are the questions, and they want a fatwa on these two. They want an answer. Is it permissible for unprecedented changes to be made to their traditions? So they're asking for a fatwa. Can they change what's happening in their shul? They ask for a fatwa. And can the prayer leader be forced to abandon what is customary? I'm still reading the translation of the letter. So that was the first question. Give us a fatwa, yes or no. Can we change or can we not change it? We don't want to change it because it's an old shul, etc. But that's the first question. They're actually asking for a fatwa to support rationalist Rambam Judaism, certainly in that synagogue. The second question that to ask, is it permissible for change and innovation to be made in the days of Islam? May God cause them to endure. See, they didn't hate the Muslims, even if those who effect change are pious. Look here. Those who want to effect change are pious. What does pious mean? Chassidim. What does Chassidim mean? Jewish Sufis, because we know that's what was going on. They are Sufis. There are many Sufis within you, within your religion, right? So these are Sufis. Now, even though they're Sufis, can you not still respect us that we have a right to perpetuate Rambam, who you so respect because of his great history with your people? So it's a fascinating letter. We know that you are predominantly Sufi as well, but can you not see the bigger picture that there are Jews who do not want to be Sufis? You Muslims, may you endure, would understand this, and they're appealing for their better judgment and for the issue of a fatwa. Okay, so that's the one letter. I'm going to quickly go to the second letter. We can do that very quickly because it's basically now, fast forward a couple of years later, now the mystics are in control of the shul. Just remember this now, we're now going, we've now turned the tables. The mystics are now running it. They've been there for 20 years now, so they've got a chazaka in the shul. Now they are bowing. I don't know what's happened with the fatwa. We'd have to try to find more documents to find out. I don't know what happened. It will be interesting. I don't even know what the fatwa was, and I don't even know if one was issued. I've no idea. But we have another letter where the mystics are in control. They've been in control for 20 years. They've been bowing and they've been curtsing for 20 years, and they've changed the nusach, and they're running the shul. It's now a Hasidic shul. It's a Jewish Sufi shul. It's now a mystical shul. Okay. Now, look what happens. That's the second document. Now, this is written in 1240. This is 3 years after Avraham ben Rambam had died. Avraham, the Rambam's son, had died. Okay? But it's still a mystic shul, and remember, 5 generations still continue to be Jewish mystics now. The mystics now write this letter. The first letter was written by the Rationalists. This letter is now written by the mystics. And if you look at the two letters, the structure is very, very similar. The writing is very similar. So in the earlier letter, written by the Rationalists, it says, what action can be taken with regard to them? You know, the pious people, but refers to them as them. You know, them is the mystics. Because remember, it's in the plural. They were ganging up. What can we do about them? So it's a few of us versus a lot of them. So I think you can see that alluded to in the wording of the letters. What action can you take against them? That was the first letter. In the second letter, that same, remember I said the structure was the same. the wording is the same, but one word was changed. What action can be taken against him? In this cases, in the second letter written by the mystics, yeah, to complain about one or two. Now they would be very old men, and it looks like the chazan remained the chazan in the shul, and he still remembered Rambam. Rambam had been dead now for almost 40 years, 35 years now, when this letter was written. So people would have been alive, they would have remembered, but they would have been outnumbered and they would have been in the minority. But they were stubborn and they're still holding on in the same shul, still complaining about the innovations of the mystics, which had been part and parcel of the experience for the last 20 years. But now there's a stubborn chazan left behind in the shul, who's always complaining. He doesn't bow down in the Amud. He remains davening his Amidah, standing. So the mystics now complaining about him. In the early letter, they're complaining about them, the rebels, in plural, the mystic rebels. Now they're complaining about one guy supporting Rambam, the rationalist guy, who doesn't want to give in to the established now for 20 years customs of the mystics. And they felt that by writing now to the Sunni Orthodox Ayyubids who were in control at this time, they would find the mystical innovations reprehensible. That's why they were writing to them. They were hoping that they'd get some kind of support. So here's the letter. Here's the letter. A group of Jews whose word is authoritative. This is our second letter now. I'm almost finished. Who are the authoritative Jews in Egypt now at this time, historically? No longer Rambam, it's now Avram ben Rambam and the mystics. So a group of Jews whose word, and again, just like in the first letter, they say we have a synagogue that's been here for ages. You know, as we have authority, that was written by the Rationalists. This one written by the mystics is saying, no, we are a certain group of Jews. Once again, we identify that we're Rabbinite Jews, but we've been here for a long time. How long is long? 20 years. Not for a long time, but we've been here for 20 years. The mystics have been running the show now in this shul now for 20 years. Namely, the head of the Jews. So, and he's the head of the Jews. So you've got to respect him. Who's the head of the Jews? Well, it was Avram ben Rambam. He had just been dead for 3 years now. So it was probably his son, the second Nagid, who came after Avram ben Rambam, but still a mystic Sufi. We have now established the practice. Look at the wording. We have a chazaka. We've established the custom of genuflection. That's the curtsy and prostration, and of bowing down, full face prostration, bow down at the ground in our worship. And we do this because it's an ancient temple practice that we've revived. So they think that the Muslims would respect that history. It came from the Jewish temple. But it's been a practice that has fallen into disuse within the Jewish community now for ages, because we haven't had a temple for a long time. But we're reviving it, which is a good thing, because we appreciate history. We want to go back and act the way we used to, and pray the way we used to pray in our temple. So now it's been re-established after a long period of time since the temple, but we've been doing it now for 20 years. So we have a kind of a precedent already. Now, the Chazan wants to abolish this practice. He's still holding on to the Rambam's views of not bowing. What action should be taken with regard to him? And there we have the difference between the reference to them and to him, because now it's them versus the him. The mystics are fighting now against the Chazan in the shul who wants to keep the old customs. Grant us your opinion, may God have mercy upon you. And there we go. And that is that second letter. Once again, looking for a fatwa to support the mystics. So in conclusion, what do we have? We have two unusual letters in the Cairo Geniza. been rather neglected by scholars, perhaps gone somewhat unnoticed because they're written in Arabic. The first letter seems to be written by the Rationalists, supporters of Rambam, of Maimonides, and the second seems to be written by the mystic followers of Avraham ben Rambam and the Sufis. It seems to be a window seat into the early days of the Maimonidean conflict. So those of you who are interested in seeing how Judaism did an absolute about turn from rationalism to mysticism and changed the trajectory of future Judaism may find these two letters of great interest, because, as I say, it's a front row seat into the tensions playing out in the early days of the Maimonidean conflict. And what is significant is both factions turn to the Islamic religious authority. They can't settle it amongst their own Bate Din. They want it settled by a fatwa. The only similarity or the only analogy I can make is if you're davening the shul and someone changes the nusach of the shul, instead of going to the Beth Din, you go to your local police station and you say, come, and you tell them the non-Jewish police station, they're changing the nusach in the shul. I mean, this is, to my mind, exactly what was going on. Both sides were appealing to, or appealing for a fatwa to be issued, hoping that the Islamic authorities would unilaterally settle an internal Jewish debate, a debate that went on to inform the very future of Judaism. And whether or not these fatwas were issued and which fatwas were in fact issued may in fact, if we do further research and ever discover it, may have been the straw that broke the camel's back, and that legally affected that change that turned Judaism into a predominantly mystical religion, as opposed to going on a new trajectory towards rationalism. And when the Zohar later came out, the Zohar may have been built, and the interest in mystical thinking, which was stirring at the time, may have been built on events such as we've discussed right now, adding fuel to the fire, which allowed the Zohar to be published 86 years later, or after Rambam died in 1290. I thank you so much for listening and looking forward to seeing you again next time.